Pollination via animals is usually a mutualistic arrangement. That is, it is mutually beneficial for both the plant and its pollinator. The most common trade-off is the animal gets a meal in exchange for furnishing a gamete transport service for the plant. This isn't always the case, though. Sometimes the reward may be different, but the pollinator still gets at least some benefit from the deal. However, sometimes pollination is not so much about cooperation as deception. Sometimes the plant tricks the pollinator. There are a number of examples of this to be found among the various corpse flowers, which mimic rotting carrion to dupe flies into a temporary visit. However, this is by no means the cruelest form of pollination. There are plants that practice a far more treacherous sort of mendacity upon the pollinators they pick. These practitioners of pernicious pollinating perjury are found among one of the largest plant groups, the orchids. Orchids are a very diverse group of plants, with nearly 30,000 species grouped into almost 900 genera. For the sake of context, roughly 1 in every 10 species of flowering plant is an orchid of some kind. With so many species, there is a dizzying variety of shapes, colors, and scents among the flowers. The plants themselves are similarly varied. For today, let us focus upon just one particular genus of orchid. The genus Ophrys includes species found in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and a number of islands. On the whole, they seem to be particularly common around the Mediterranean. The genus name refers to eyebrows, possibly in reference to the fuzzy edges found on some of the species' floral structures. These particular orchids are often referred to as bee orchids. This may be due to the fact that most are pollinated by bees. It may also be due to a passing resemblance found within the flowers. Not surprisingly, this is related to their pollination strategy. Rather than offering a reward, these orchids offer a lie. Whether it is a bee or a wasp, their pollinators are always male. These particular flowers have adapted to mimic their female counterparts. Now, at a glance, one might look at one of these flowers and be fairly pressed to see the resemblance. However, it is important to remember 3 basic points. First, the vision of bees is generally across a different spectrum to our own. They can see ultraviolet light while we cannot. However, we can detect red light while they generally don't. So, with this shifted spectrum, their perception is going to be rather different to ours. Second, the resolution of a bee's eye is considerably lower than that of a human eye. Being generous, let us assume that each eye has 10,000 ommatidia, that is, 10,000 individual optical components. Each of these components detects light in a specific direction and is perceived as a spot of appropriate color and brightness. So very roughly, the vision of a bee with 20,000 ommatidia would be equivalent to the resolution of a computer screen 100 pixels high and 200 pixels wide. That would be about 1/7 of the dimensions of a common phone screen resolution of 720 pixels by 1280 pixels. That sort of resolution is fine for general navigation, avoiding flying into large objects, noticing patches of floral color on a green backdrop, and so on. However, it isn't really great for picking out fine details, like for instance the difference between an unusual flower and a bee's abdomen. Which brings us to the third point. Like a great many other insects, bees use pheromones for recognition during courtship. A female bee is primarily recognized by her scent, in other words. While the orchids may approach only a very rough visual approximation of a bee, they have a finely tuned chemical mimicry. In fact, this aspect of the mimicry is so fine-tuned that each species of bee orchid is pollinated by only one species of bee or wasp. This specificity is very much to the orchid's benefit. In most other cases, a pollinator might visit dozens of different plant species in a single day. Any pollen transmitted between flowers of different species is essentially wasted pollen. With the bee orchids, the males are only going to be drawn to one specific sort of flower, and the flower will be visited by only one specific sort of pollinator. This leads to far less pollen in places where it does no good. So, having considered the general pattern, let us look more closely at a specific example. Ophrys apifera is a common species of bee orchid found in the Mediterranean, continental Europe, and the British Isles. The species name translates into bee holder or bee carrier, in reference to the vaguely bee-like flowers. In the more northerly part of its range, it tends to persist mainly by self-pollination, but around the Mediterranean, it enlists the species Eucera longicornis as a dedicated pollinator. This bee is one of the tribe Eucerini, a diverse group of solitary bees. Like many others in this group, Eucera is known for its long antennae. The males especially have remarkably long antennae. In fact, the name Eucera is essentially Greek for good horn or true horn or proper horn in reference to these antennae. The species name longicornis is essentially Latin for longhorn. So yes, this bee's scientific name would translate approximately into good horn longhorn. With a name like that, it could almost serve as a cartoon character. Normally, these ample antennae serve the male bee quite well in detecting the pheromones emitted by the females. Alas, they are also quite good at picking up the allomones given off by Ophrys apifera. Incidentally, a pheromone is a chemical used by a member of a species to communicate with another of its own species, while an allomone is a chemical used by one species to communicate with a different species. Of course, this communication could take any number of forms. One good example of an allomone is the spray of a skunk, which is approximately a communication of "leave me alone." Returning to the bee orchids. At a glance, the flowers of Ophrys apifera appear to consist of 3 pink petals surrounding a central modified petal. In fact, this central structure is the only true petal out of that particular group. The pink trio are actually sepals. The other true petals on these flowers are a pair of small green fuzzy structures. They emerge on a column just above the central petal. This central petal, also known as a labellum, is typically patterned with a blend of reddish-brown, yellow, and white. When a suitable bee in a suitable frame of mind approaches, he is drawn in at a distance by the pink sepals, that and the familiar, if rather deceptive, scent. The labellum functions as a landing site of sorts, and it is the recipient of the unfortunate male's ardent amorous attentions. While he is thus occupied, he most often brushes against a pair of sticky clumps of pollen that dangle just above the labellum, arising from the column that supports the small green petals above. Most often, he leaves with one or both of these sticky pollinia adhering to his body. Naturally, the bee is more than a little disappointed at being duped in this manner, but there isn't much to do but go on with life, at least until he finds his way to another false female. The first time, he was unknowingly picking up a pollen delivery. The second time, he delivers this pollen in the process of his ill-conceived attempts at copulation. Granted, some bees are smart enough to not be fooled a second time, and so the orchid strategy is not without some element of risk. However, between a few gullible bees and the ability to self-pollinate, this particular species of orchid appears to be in no danger of dying out anytime soon. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this brief glimpse into the more unusual side of the natural world. If you wish to know more, here are a few things that might be worth looking into. If you found this enjoyable, feel free to leave a like. If you think others would enjoy this content, by all means, share. If you have something to say or ask about, honest comments are always welcome. If you wish to see more from this channel, a subscription would be most helpful. Until next time.